They were convinced their panzers were invincible. The Panzer III and IV had proven themselves against Polish cavalry, French Char B1s, and British Matildas in the sweeping victories across Europe. German tank crews believed their medium tanks represented the pinnacle of armored warfare design, perfectly suited for the lightning strikes of blitzkrieg. They had crushed every enemy they encountered. They were wrong. The story of how they discovered this begins not with defeat but with confidence born from years of success. The T-34 was no accident of design. It was the product of careful military planning that began in the late 1930s, when the Soviet Red Army recognized a critical gap in its armored forces. The BT-series light tanks, the Soviet workhorse, could manage impressive speeds on roads but were lightly armored and vulnerable in direct combat. This was adequate for skirmishes, but utterly inadequate for the mechanized warfare the army envisioned. Soviet military planners had watched with alarm as other nations developed more balanced armored forces. They wanted a tank that could combine firepower, protection, and mobility, that could navigate the vast steppes of Russia, the forests of Europe, and that could be produced in quantities their industrial base could sustain. The Kharkiv Locomotive Factory's design bureau, under Mikhail Koshkin, issued specifications in 1937. The new tank would weigh around 26 tons, mount a 76.2mm gun, achieve speeds of 53 km/h, and have sloped armor sufficient to resist anti-tank fire. Most importantly, it would be simple to manufacture and maintain. Koshkin, who had risen through the ranks as a talented engineer, took on the challenge. His most notable innovation was the extensive use of sloped armor, a concept that increased effective thickness without adding weight. By June 1939, the first prototypes, designated A-20 and A-32, were completed. The prototypes impressed military observers during field trials in Ukraine and at proving grounds near Moscow. It was fast, reaching 53 km/h on roads and maintaining 25-30 km/h cross-country. It was maneuverable, with wide tracks that distributed weight evenly, exerting less ground pressure than a human foot. The Christie suspension system, adapted from American designs, absorbed shocks well and allowed the tank to traverse rough terrain that would have stopped other vehicles. And it was mechanically reliable, using a V234 12-cylinder diesel engine that produced 500 horsepower at 1,800 RPM. The diesel engine was a particular point of pride for Soviet engineers, making the tank less vulnerable to fires than gasoline-powered vehicles. Diesel fuel was also more readily available in the Soviet Union, particularly in remote areas where gasoline supplies were limited. The engine could run for hours on its internal fuel capacity of 460 liters, giving the tank an operational range of approximately 400 kilometers on roads. Trials revealed some problems. The initial turret was cramped for the two-man crew, making aiming while moving difficult and causing fatigue. Engineers addressed this by refining the suspension and adding braces, but the rough ride would characterize the T-34 in early service. In 1939, at a meeting with the Defense Council, the T-34 was formally presented as the potential main tank for mechanized units. Infantry representatives had concerns. They argued that the armor, while innovative, might not hold against heavier guns. Tank advocates countered that the sloped design and mobility compensated for any perceived thinness, and that the tank's firepower was adequate for its role. After debate, the design was accepted. The T-34 was officially adopted in December 1939. Production began at the Kharkiv factory in 1940. The T-34 was a medium tank by any standard. It measured 6.68 meters long, 3 meters wide, and 2.45 meters tall. In American measurements, that was 21 feet 11 inches long, 9 feet 10 inches wide, and 8 feet tall. The weight came in at 26.5 tons for the basic model 1940, reaching 28 tons loaded. The armor was revolutionary, 45 mm at its thickest on the hull front, sloped at 60 degrees for effective thickness of over 90 mm against projectiles. Turret armor was 45-52 mm, also sloped. Soviet designers had calculated this was sufficient to stop 37 mm and 50 mm anti-tank rounds at combat ranges. They were designing for the enemies they expected, German panzers from the Spanish Civil War era and potential threats from Japan. Inside, the tank was functional but cramped, The crew consisted of 4 men in early models, driver in the front hull with limited vision through periscopes, a hull machine gunner beside him operating a 7.62mm DT gun, the gunner in the turret, and the commander who doubled as loader. This commander had a demanding job: command the tank, direct the driver, communicate via radio when available, only platoon leaders had them initially, load and fire the 76.2mm L11 gun, later F-34, and operate a rear machine gun. German tankers, who later examined captured T-34s, marveled at the endurance required. The commander stood throughout combat, head exposed if the hatch was open for vision, or confined with minimal visibility if closed. The turret rotated by hand crank or electric motor in later models, requiring effort. There was barely room to move, but in its intended role against anticipated opponents, the T-34 performed well, very well indeed. The tank first saw limited action in the Winter War against Finland in 1939-1940, where prototypes proved their mobility in snow. But significant combat came in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. Here the T-34 faced real opposition. German Panzer IIIs mounted 50mm guns, Panzer IV 75mm short-barreled howitzers. German armor was thicker in places but lacked sloping. The battles were brutal. On June 23, 1941, near Rasenia in Lithuania, a single T-34 from the 2nd Tank Division held up the German 6th Panzer Division for hours. Commanded by an unnamed sergeant, it ambushed a column, destroying trucks and artillery before being immobilized. German 88mm flak guns finally knocked it out, after dozens of hits bounced off. The Germans lost 12 vehicles and many men. This was no isolated incident. In Ukraine, T-34s of the 5th Mechanized Corps charged German positions, their sloped armor deflecting shells, while their 76mm guns punched through. Panzer hulls at 500 meters. German tank crews gained experience, but bred dangerous assumptions, that their panzers were superior overall. The assumption was tested at Barbarossa's outset, where T-34s clashed with Wehrmacht armor along the border. Soviet forces had about 967 T-34s operational, spread thin. Initial assaults achieved success through surprise and aggression. T-34s destroyed dozens of panzers, but counterattacks revealed vulnerabilities. Poor radios led to uncoordinated attacks. Mechanical breakdowns, transmissions failed after 100 kilometers, and crew inexperience from Stalin's purges. By the end of 1941, the Soviets lost over 2,300 T-34s, mostly to breakdowns or abandonment. Lessons were clear. The T-34 outmatched German tanks individually, but tactics and reliability needed work. Soviet leadership focused on improvements, better training, radios in every tank by 1943, and simplified production. The war continued, and the T-34 remained effective where deployed en masse. When the Germans pushed toward Moscow in October 1941, T-34s spearheaded counteroffensives. Near Mtsensk, Colonel Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade ambushed the 4th Panzer Division. Katukov's crews used camouflage and hit-and-run tactics. One T-34 under Lieutenant Lavrinenko destroyed 6 panzers in a day. General Heinz Guderian, inspecting the wreckage, wrote in his diary, "For the first time, it became clear that our Panzer III and a few were inferior." He demanded copies of the T-34 for study, leading to German designs like the Panther. These early victories reinforced Soviet confidence. From their perspective, the T-34 was performing as designed, mobile, hard-hitting, and producible in numbers that overwhelmed. But the Germans adapted. By 1942, they fielded longer 75mm guns on Panzer IVs and introduced Tigers with 88mm cannons. The T-34's armor, once impenetrable, could now be pierced at range. At Stalingrad, T-34s fought in urban ruins, their low silhouette aiding ambushes. One crew, led by Sergeant Nikolai Bolotov, held a factory block for 3 days, destroying 14 vehicles before being overrun. The turning point came at Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets had 3,000 tanks, many T-34s facing 2,700 German. At Prokhorovka, over 800 tanks clashed. T-34s charged at close range, ramming Tigers when guns jammed. Major Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army lost 400 tanks but halted the German advance. A German prisoner later told interrogators, "We thought our Panthers would crush them, but those T-34s came like a storm, endless, fearless." Kursk was different. The salient was strategically vital, a bulge in the front line. If the Germans pinched it off, they could encircle Soviet armies. Hitler knew this. He delayed for new tanks. Among defenders was the first tank army with hundreds of T-34s. The Germans began their assault on July 5, 1943. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein ordered Panzers forward at A400. By 800, Tigers hit Soviet lines under heavy fire from dug-in T-34s. The Red Army established a defense in depth, but it was not secure. German artillery reached positions. Counterattacks continued. On July 12 at Prokhorovka, Rotmistrov committed his reserves. T-34s advanced in waves. German machine gunners opened fire with MG-42s, but these were not the .50 calibers of Saipan. The T-34's sloped armor shrugged off small arms. The real shock came from the tank duel. Panther crews in their new 45-ton beasts with 75 mm KWK-42 guns expected dominance. The KWK could penetrate T-34 armor at 2,000 meters, but Soviets closed to 500 meters, where T-34 guns were effective. Tracer rounds arced. The sound was thunderous, 76-meter booms against 75-meter cracks. Gunners aimed for tracks and turrets. Inside a T-34, crews experienced revelation. Heavy shells didn't just impact, they spalled rivets inside, wounding men. But the sloping held against glancing hits. One Soviet gunner firing at a Panther watched his round ricochet off the mantlet, then adjusted and penetrated the side. The Panther burned. German commanders couldn't process it. They had trained for years, fought in France where enemies fled. Their tanks were supposed to protect them, but Soviet guns defeated their armor at close range. Not just Tigers, but Panthers too. A German officer, captured after his Panther was disabled, told Soviet interrogators his first thought was that the Russians had secret ammunition. He couldn't accept a standard 76mm could defeat German steel. In his experience, from Poland to France, enemy fire bounced off. But the T-34's F-34 was in a different category, with velocity exceeding 2,000 FTS and AP rounds penetrating 69mm at 500 meters, enough for Panther sides. And Soviets had them everywhere, standard in mechanized corps. As the attack faltered, T-34s moved forward. The contrast was stark. Panther weighed 45 tons, T-34 26.5. Panther had 80mm frontal armor at 55 degrees, effective 140 mm. T-34 45mm at 60 degrees, effective 90 mm. But T-34 was faster, more reliable, with tracks that conquered mud where Panthers bogged. EM rounds struck T-34s with effect, but at Kursk, numbers told, Soviets replaced losses overnight. Disabled tanks burned, illuminating the field. Infantry clung to hulls fighting close. One Soviet crewman reported a Panther passing over his foxhole. He threw a Molotov, igniting fuel. By July 16th, the offensive was over. 760 German tanks lost, counted by Soviets. For the Red Army, victory was grim but pivotal. They stopped Citadel at cost. But for Germans examining wrecks, truth emerged. Soviet tanks were formidable, not the junk expected. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. Prisoners grappled with truths. Their equipment, once superior, was matched. Intelligence noted shock at Soviet firepower and quantity. Many felt betrayed, sent with inadequate numbers while told of technological edge. One veteran from France told interrogators he believed Germany would win through superior engineering. After Kursk, seeing T-34s shrug off hits and counter, he knew spirit couldn't overcome masses. These reports informed Soviet tactics. T-34s were a serious threat to Panzers. Combined with Su-85s and air support, Red Army had superiority. Word spread. You didn't need heavies to engage Panzers. Your T-34 would do at close range. Kursk continued weeks after, through gullies and fields. Secured by August 23, 1943. Victory had consequences. With Kursk won, Soviets launched offensives to Berlin. Psychological blow to Hitler. He cancelled further attacks. For the first time, German media admitted setbacks. For Soviet crews post-Kursk, pattern repeated. On Dnieper, T-34s crossed rivers outflanking. In Bagration 1944, 2,300 T-34s destroyed Army Group Center. Numerical disparity, 31 in places. Qualitative 2. T-34-85 with 85mm gun penetrated Tigers at 1,000 meters. In August 1945, against Japan in Manchuria, T-34-85s of the 6th Guards Tank Army traversed mountains, overwhelming Type 97s. Japanese lost 21 tanks in hours. The experience of Soviet crews was gradual realization. What they believed about equipment was right. The T-34, flawed early, became war winner through iteration. For Germans, lessons different. Industrial might matters. Having quality couldn't overcome 10-1 disadvantages. Post-war surviving T-34s went to Aberdeen. Americans measured. Hull 45mm sloped, turret 52mm, tested steel, high hardness, effective versus small calibers. Layout, 100 QFT fighting space, better than Hago. Compared to Panther, T-34 simpler, cheaper, $30,000 versus $117,000. Every T-34 had radio by 1943. Gyro stabilizers added. The T-34 represented the gap between what Germany planned and what the Soviets produced. When first 76mm rounds punched through Panzers at Rasenyi, they proved in industrial war production and design matter. No skill overcomes generational gaps in quantity and quality. The German crews who advanced in June 1941 believed in reliable machines. By Kursk, survivors knew truth, sent to fight with armor vulnerable to a tank that embodied Soviet resilience, and nothing they could do but fight on, in a war turning against them.